Aaron Berkowitz back with the JLJ, and we have Jennifer Steil, the author of Exile Music, which won grand prize in the Islands 2020 Book Awards, the Multicultural International Book Award, and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Lesbian Fiction Award. Previous books include the novel The Ambassador's Wife and memoir The Woman Who Fell from the Sky. Thanks for being with us tonight, Jennifer.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for pronouncing my last name correctly. No one ever
That's
does
good.
that.
I was worried, it can go either way. I took a
Yeah.
guess at the stab. I'm glad that worked out though.
Yeah.
The first question I have is just why this book and why now?
Well, I moved to Bolivia in 2012 because my husband was at the time employed by the EU, and he was working in Bolivia as the head of delegation for the EU, which is what took our family there. We still have a daughter, but she was almost 3 when we moved there. So while actually very early on in our days in La Paz, which is at around 12,000 feet, 3,500 meters, depending on how you're measuring. My husband came home from work one day and he'd had a meeting with the honorary Austrian consul. And he came home and said, "Did you know that there were 20,000 Jewish refugees here in Bolivia during World War II?" And I said, "No. I mean, I've read about a lot of the diaspora in other parts of South America, in Brazil or Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, but I hadn't read anything about the Jewish community in La Paz." And La Paz poses challenges that are above and beyond many of the challenges in the more developed countries. It is at high altitude, and that alone can be tricky, and was the least developed of South American countries, and still remains so, I think, just in terms of technology and making life easier. So I thought, well, that's fascinating. And then a few weeks later, I met a man named John Galerter, whose parents fled the Nazis in Austria, no, not Austria, Poland. Was a part of Poland that then became part of Ukraine, and then part of the USSR, and then part of Ukraine again, I think. But his parents spoke Polish, and they made it to Bolivia in 1940, I believe. And he was a violinist and the concertmaster of Bolivia's symphony orchestra. And he told me his family story, which was really interesting. And I'd been working on a different book, my previous book. And so I wasn't actively looking for something to write about, but I started looking around to see what else had been written about this population and couldn't find anything. I found memoirs, a lot of which were written just for family, to record their story. I read every single memoir I could get my hands on. Leo Spitzer wrote a beautiful memoir called Hotel Bolivia. He grew up in La Paz till he was 10. And I thought, well, I feel like there's more to this story. I don't feel like enough attention has been drawn to this population. And I didn't want to write, I contemplated writing a nonfiction book because my background is journalism, and I could have reported it as a journalist. My first book was memoir, so nonfiction. But the problem was that so many of the people who were alive back then are now dead. And if I were trying to create narratives, I would have such gaping holes in the narrative, because even the survivors I ended up interviewing couldn't remember certain periods of time. And I just thought I would be painting too sketchy of a portrait for readers to be able to get swept up in. And I thought I might be able to tell almost a truer story by writing a historical work of fiction. And so sorry, that's a very long answer to your question.
No,
Um, yeah.
that's fine. You were mentioning about sort of the small, I guess when we think of like the diaspora, it does sort of end up being mostly Europe and the United States, right? We think of London, or we think of wherever in the United States or Canada, perhaps. But the South America, we forget oftentimes of the South American communities. A lot of Jews ended up in Shanghai, which, it has its own community. And it is sort of Eurocentric, Western-centric when we think about those who fled the Nazis, sort of the Western developed world that we often get wrapped up in. So it is interesting to think that there are enclaves that are not really talked about or studied in terms of what occurred after. It's also interesting that it took sort of I don't, I can't imagine what brought up the conversation of 20,000 Jewish refugees in a conversation that led your husband speaking to you. It's just sort of interesting how the dominoes fell there.
Well, my husband knows that I've always been really interested in Jewish history, and I mean, so he knew I'd be interested in this topic, and he thought that it should be written about. And so that's often why he tells me lots of stuff. He'll come home from work with all kinds of ideas, and I haven't used all of them because I don't have enough time. But he says he has a good eye for untold stories. And I mean, it was interesting because, by 1938, there were only 3 countries still offering visas to Jews trying to flee the Nazis. So in those 3 countries, the Dominican Republic, and as you mentioned, Shanghai, Japan occupied Shanghai, and Bolivia. And not many people actually know that. I found in giving talks to various groups, they don't really know much about why those countries, and they each have their own reasons, were still offering visas. And so that in itself was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that I work with a large Dominican population in my day job, and they often do talk about how the Jewish immigrants in the 1940s, and some of them are old enough to, if not maybe they were old enough, or their parents were definitely old enough to sort of see that migration, and they do talk about that. So it's interesting, sort of the outside perspective, the outside of the Western, let's say, perspective that comes up. When you were going through the research, it is interesting you mentioned that you thought about nonfiction. You just I'm not a journalist, my background is not journalism, but how do you sort of go about taking those interviews? Do you start with one person and they introduce you to another? Do you do, what's the research process sort of like?
I researched this book for 5 years over several countries. So I started with the survivors. Yes, one introduced me to another. My friend John Galernter was very useful, but he introduced me to a man named Guillermo. His original name was Wilhelm Wiener, and he was born in Vienna and fled Vienna when he was 8 years old. And he told me in detail about the ship crossing when he was 8 years old. And he talked to me about how he learned Spanish, which was from his landlady's children. And that's how my main character ends up learning Spanish as well. And so he gave me a lot of interesting details about what La Paz was like in the 1940s. He ended up owning several different cinemas and was the head of the Cinematographers Association in La Paz. And Austria at one point invited him back, and he said, never, never, never will I ever go back to Austria after what they've done to us. And so he was one of my primary inspirations and research. So I interviewed him several times. But then I also started thinking, I had to decide what my characters did for a living before they were expelled. And so perhaps because my friend John is a violinist, I thought I want them to be musicians. Plus, I always want to give my characters jobs that I wish I could do, but I can't, because it allows me to live vicariously through them. So I made the dad in my family played viola with the Vienna Philharmonic. And so that got me started researching the Vienna Philharmonic, which has a horrific record of, they expelled all their Jewish musicians, as you're nodding, so you probably know part of this history. And, many of them died, and others were, sent into exile. And they continued to employ Nazis until 1967, which was not something I knew until I was researching them specifically. And I don't think there's been enough written about this. There have been books written, but mostly in German. And I became quite interested in the history of the Philharmonic. And I also became quite interested in preserving the names of those Jewish musicians. So I made sure they were all in my book because I wanted to memorialize them somehow. And then the mother was an opera singer. And so my protagonist, who's a young girl when the book starts. She's around 10, I think, when the book starts. Grows up in a musical family and is musical, and she has a best friend who's not Jewish. And so as the Nazis grow closer and anti-Semitism is much more obvious every day, that causes tensions, not necessarily with her friend, but with her friend's family. I seem to have
Yeah,
gone
no,
off
it's
topic, but
interesting that you were saying that the music is not from you, because I was going to ask. I know your structure is around classical, structure, and obviously your characters are musicians in a sense. So I was curious as to sort of the metaphor that you're trying to, to me, music as voice, and sort of the construction of, once you have the interviews and you're doing all the research, like how do you then constructing a overarching idea that melds it all together into one narrative does seem a little daunting.
yes, although for me, things happen little by little. I don't, when I write my first drafts, I had to do, this was the most research heavy book I've ever written. All my books have required research, but this one required the most. There's sometimes where I just had to stop in the middle of a chapter and then go do some research and then come back, which I found distressing, because I wanted to keep in the flow of the writing, and sometimes I just couldn't because I was missing, I had holes. But with the music, I always knew that was really central to the book, in that I find that, at least for me, the way I cope with any sort of trauma is through writing. And I feel that a lot of people use some kind of art form, whether it's painting or music or writing or something, to help draw themselves through nearly unlivable trauma. And so I was thinking, if you were a musician, how would you use music to create a bridge from your old life in Austria and your new life in Bolivia? And the ways in which you use music to adapt to in the case of my refugees, to their new country, says a lot about each of the characters. So, for example, the father, is of course devastated to be expelled by the Vienna Philharmonic and everything. But by the time they get to Bolivia and he has to make a living, he's teaching Bolivian musicians and starts to learn about Bolivian instruments that he didn't know much about before. And he finds a sense of freedom in being freed from the repertoire that he was playing in the Vienna Philharmonic, and learning new kinds of sounds. And so while he doesn't become a Bolivian musician, he's still a very much an Austrian musician. He comes to appreciate a different form of music and enjoys experimenting and playing with Bolivian musicians. So uses it as a way to connect with people in his new place. Orly, the daughter, being the youngest and the most flexible, eventually learns a Bolivian instrument and kind of makes it her own. And the mother, who has left her son behind in Europe, cannot cope with his loss. And because I think singing comes from a different place maybe than other kinds of music, because it's your body. And I feel that even if you're singing the saddest song in the world, you're singing a lament in an opera, there is joy in the act of singing, even if you're singing something very sad. And she doesn't have enough joy left to sing. And so she stops singing entirely, and therefore denies herself a way to relate to her new country and her new experiences, and doesn't have an outlet. And she struggles the most in adapting to their new circumstances and causes her family a lot of trouble. But I don't want to give too much away.
It's interesting to think of the voice as instrument. If you talk to trained singers, they very much do try to separate, I guess, what most people think of as singing, right? That it's, and they really do focus on themselves as instrumentation. So it's interesting to see that sort of dichotomy being played out. How we sort of use the body in different ways. Are we inhabiting it? Are we using it? And how we sort of can see that in the characters. I was curious as to the idea of belonging that permeates the book. It seems to me that there is an inherent tension, right? The father is attempting to learn different instrumentation, but never really quite acclimates and appreciates it, but from a distance, where the mother is fully distant, and then obviously the daughter is acclimated to the country. In some ways, that's a function of age, but I'm just curious as to sort of perhaps a more approach to Jewishness in a way where Jews are seen as separate, even if they belong to a country. So I was curious as to how that factored in to the characterization.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. Is so, these Orly's father had fought in World War One, and thought of himself as Austrian, and then the Austrians told him he wasn't because he was Jewish, and so he wasn't. He eventually thought of as part of Austria, whereas he had always thought of himself as Austria. They were kind of at odds as to who he was, and I'm really interested in that liminal space where you don't belong to one place or another. Maybe because I live in it, I've probably moved a dozen times over the past year. But we move every 3 or 4 years anyway as a family. And I don't live in the country I was born in. I haven't since 2006. And so I don't know where my sense of belonging lies anymore. It's kind of hard to find a mooring sometimes because you're always an outsider, which is how my characters were beginning to feel in Austria before they had to flee. And even I mean, it was interesting when I interviewed people. I interviewed all kinds of people in Bolivia, and some of the non-Jewish people who were alive at that time as well. And the two communities really did not mix, for the most part. The refugees, quite understandably, for protectiveness and safety in numbers and with their own culture and language, tended to stick together. Although a lot of the kids spoke fluent Spanish, and were fully integrated, like Guillermo. Guillermo considered himself utterly Bolivian. He was Bolivian till his last breath. He'd made that decision, and kind of listening to him talk about, unbecoming Austrian and becoming Bolivian made me think about what my characters might decide. Where would they decide they belonged? I mean, that's one of the decisions Orly has to make. Does she belong in Europe? Is she still Austrian in some way, or is she more Bolivian now, having now spent the majority of her life there, and raised a child there? So sorry, I don't want to I just gave something away, but it's not a major plot point.
I was curious as to why you picked the younger protagonist. I mean, it seems like you could have used one of the parents. So I was curious as to how you got to, a 10-year-old narrator.
Right. I think that's largely Guillermo that made me want to. Oh, actually, I've got two reasons for that. So Guillermo was talking about his experiences being 8 and how easy it was for him to learn Spanish and how completely integrated he felt with the Bolivians. And I mean, he just had nothing but wonderful things to say about his upbringing in Bolivia. And I figured that, when you're that young, and having seen my daughter move from country to country, I mean, kids just pick up languages like little sponges. And I wanted a character who would be capable of picking up everything, and adapting, so that the choice would be genuine, so that she would, she'd be fluent in Spanish. But what did that mean? She was Bolivian or not? Did it just mean she was an Austrian who was fluent in Spanish? But I wanted someone who would be better able to adapt. And then she's a bit of a guide for her parents. Like a lot of immigrants have, this experience, like the kids learn English faster in the US, for example, and then help their parents who perhaps haven't learned it as fast. And I experienced this because in Bolivia, I was very studiously conjugating verbs, and my little 3-year-old was just running around speaking Spanish, and it was really maddening. So that's one reason for having a child. And I knew she was going to grow. I mean, she's in her 40s by the end of the book. But I wanted to kind of show kind of because someone young who could grow up and be a little more open to the world than the parents were. I mean, the mother is not open to Bolivia, and we wouldn't get to explore very much of the country if we stayed with her. We'd just be stuck in the house, like cooking. And the dad is kind of boring in his own way. I mean, it's not boring to him, but he is playing music all the time. Orly actually explores. She goes out, she sees the country. She sees the country with fresher eyes than her parents are capable of seeing the country. And also, she's not as contaminated, for lack of a better word, with thoughts about all the difficulties, the legal difficulties, the money difficulties, and all that stuff. And she can just see the country. I haven't actually thought about that before, but that's part of it. And the other thing is, when my daughter was 3 or 4 in Bolivia, she asked me one morning, she said, "Where did I live before Bolivia?" And I said, "You lived in London." And she said, "Before that?" And I said, "Jordan." She said, "Before that?" And I said, "Yemen." And she said, "Before that?" And I said, "You lived in my tummy." And she said, "Well, no, no, no. Where did I live before I lived in your tummy?" And I said, "Well, nowhere. You didn't exist." And this was not acceptable. She said, I existed. I existed in a land called Bunny Belts, and there's a queen bunny, and there's also a president, and I guess it was parliamentary democracy of some kind, or with a queen. But anyway, it would, everyone was vegetarian, and she made up this whole land. And as she was telling, she spent 7 years developing this land. It had visa requirements, which I did not meet, so I could never go there. We had visitors from Bunny Belts. We learned about its neighbors, and that, its cars were these little carrot mobiles that were powered by Japanese fans. And so it was really this detailed world. And I thought, and because I was thinking about who would be my protagonist for this book, and I thought, if I were a child in Austria in the 1930s, when the world is growing more frightening every single day, I would need an imaginary world. And I pictured my protagonist creating this imaginary world, but it wouldn't be very interesting if we were just watching her play alone. It was far more interesting if she was creating this world with a friend. And that's where the entire book started, was with one scene between Orly and her best friend, Annalisa. It started with Bunny Belts. It's not what it's called in the book, but I did steal my daughter's idea, and she doesn't let me do that anymore, which is, annoying.
Yeah, there's something about, talking. I remember I primarily teach immigrant students English, and there's a nice way that they phrase things sometimes, where you pick up, it's the same way you'll steal a phrase, you'll borrow a way that they learn
Right.
English, because it helps you re-examine the language. Whereas, and similarly, I would think to like how a child would re-examine a world that you encounter, but they see it very, very differently.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, Orly sees things her parents don't see, and instinctively it's easier for her to grasp things that her parents don't quite. I mean, in a way, they're still living in a little bit. They're less integrated than she is. Her best friends are all, for the most part, except for Rachel. For the most part, her friends are Bolivian. Well, one significant friend anyway.
Yeah.
Her friend Miguel.
Coming back to that writing process, you were mentioning sometimes that the flow would be interrupted by a necessity to research, but I'm also curious. Obviously, you move around a lot. There seems to be a lot going on. Do you have like a daily practice, or is it sort of a inspiration based thing, or how do you think of that habit of writing?
Um, I write almost every day. I need to. It's a compulsion as much as it is anything else. And it's also, um, it's how I process the world, I suppose. So no matter what's going on in my life, that's kind of the only consistency. I mean, maybe that's where home is for me. Some days I don't write anything more than a journal. I don't always get to whatever project I'm working on. I mean, this past year, I've been in cancer treatment for the whole last year. And my first thought on diagnosis was, I do not want to write a cancer memoir. That is not what I want to write about. And yet, I just sold an essay on my experience in the hospital here to the Kenyan Review in the US. I just couldn't help but process cancer by writing, even though I didn't want to. And so Um, yeah, so I have a really regular, I mean, if you wait for inspiration, you'll never get to the desk. I mean, I never want to sit down in a chair. I'm a really hyperactive person, so sitting is not my natural thing. So getting to the chair is always hard for me. So it has to become non-optional. I mean, yeah, there's days if there's too many medical appointments or if I'm in the middle of chemo, then yeah, I don't always. That slowed me down quite a bit. But now that I'm finally feeling better, I can't stop writing. It's just I have so many ideas because all these interesting things have happened over the past year. And I've lived in so many weird communities in London and different neighborhoods, and as I move around during treatment. Um, but
Well, I'm glad to
yeah,
hear you're feeling better, that
yeah,
things are going well. Yeah, it's interesting. It's always, I always ask every writer that question, like, is it 20 minutes a day? Is it, what is it? How does it sort of work through, especially those who've written multiple novels, at some point, I think a lot about repeating oneself, how many original ideas does one have? I don't know. I guess that's maybe not a concern. If you keep writing, at some point you strike something new.
yes. I mean, I think all three of my published books are very different from each other. I mean, the first one's a memoir for one, and it's about running a newspaper in Yemen, which is about as far from Exile music as you can possibly get. They're just completely different books. And then my first novel, The Ambassador's Wife, is also set in a country much like Yemen and starts off with a kidnapping. And the kidnapping itself was based on my own experience, but the rest of the book is fiction. And so but it's more kind of literary thrillerish, and Exile Music is historical fiction. And I've written another book now that also takes place in Bolivia, but is about an underground community. And I'm halfway through an Uzbekistan book, which is entirely different, and has some new themes for me. So, I mean, that is the thing when you're traveling all the time in a kind of in constant, you're constantly brushing up against newness and difference. And those always trigger thoughts for me. And even if it's reflecting on me and the way I respond and the things I realized, like how much the US shaped my thinking that I didn't even realize until I left the country. Things like that.
Yeah, it is interesting to, how context will affect product. I mean, I maybe that's not interesting. Maybe that's like the most basic of facts. I'm not sure.
I mean, you can be a bad travel writer. I mean, I don't really want to, I don't, I find kind of interesting parts of these countries that I think really specific stories that I do feel compelled to tell them. The stories that I've written are things I feel like I had to, I don't want to claim to have shed light on them, but draw people's attention that way. Like Exile music felt really important to me, and when I spoke to the community of third generation survivors in DC, and one of whom is the daughter of my friend John, and she said, "I'm so relieved that you wrote this book because our story's never been told, and I didn't want to write it." And it's been really great to hear from. I hear from so many, almost all my emails from readers have been from survivors, most of whom had passed through Bolivia at some point and wrote to me and said, this book is so close to my own experience. Who did you talk to? Like, how did you know this? 5 years of research.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that the specificity is what allows people to connect, right? That actually the more specific you can be, the easier it is to relate, paradoxically, perhaps. But that is a nice segue as we sort of wrap up about shedding light. Where can people find the book? Where can people find you if they want to keep up?
you can find the book pretty much anywhere books are sold. So any place online. So bookshop.org, if you want to support independent bookstores or your local independent bookstore, or Amazon, of course. So anywhere books are sold. You can also go to my website, jennifersteil.net, and that has some links to buy my books. It's So Jennifer is JENNIFERSTEIL.net. And I'm also on social media, so you can just search for my name in Instagram, Twitter, Facebook.
Perfect. Well, I just
Yeah.
wanted to thank you so much for taking time out to come speak with me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for shedding light on this community. I do think it's important to get a broader picture of the Jewish community in that way.
No, it's a pleasure. So thank you for asking me.